Welcome to Disciples of Christ History. My name is Steve Regas. I'm a member here at Liberty Christian Church in Liberty, Missouri. I am leading a 15-week series on the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I've been asked to say a little bit how this series came about. A few of you may know that I'm currently working on a book called Seeking Christ. It's about the difference between liberal Christians and conservative Christians. In the end, it will suggest at least to find a way to bridge their differences. In working on that book, I recently completed a pretty long chapter on the history of Christianity. The second factor is that Dave Culver, the pastor of this congregation, asked me last summer to teach a series on the history of the disciples of Christ, as there were a fair number of members of this congregation who really weren't aware of that. The third factor came in, and this got the region involved. I'm currently mentoring a candidate for commissioning in the region. And as part of the process, he has to take a class in the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there's no really good local option for that. And in speaking with the region, they said if he watches this series, it would fulfill that criteria for him, but they would also like to put it on the regional website for anyone else who wanted to study the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. I am honored to have you as my guest for this, and thank you for being here. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to week 11. And I have to tell you, if you looked in the newsletter, my title does not match the title that Troy announced. After last week, actually I was going to cut the class from 15 to 14 weeks. But after last week, Pam Strang came up to me, and I know that she and Terry are not going to be here today, but they're going to watch it. Pam asked me a really great question. And it's like, I got to address this. Because they had been here the week before when we looked at the differences in the Bible, things that didn't seem to fit. And then last week I talked about the historical critical method being taught in schools. And she goes, well, so teaching that basically means teaching things that the Bible don't agree. And I go, yeah, but it's way, way more than that. Now, let me give you an example. Part of us studying the historical critical method is it's important to know this. Most of you are parents, and at some point in life, your children find out about the facts of life. Now, would you rather they learn about sex education from you all in class or on the playground? I think we know the answer to that. There are discrepancies, there are historical problems with the Bible. When I was a pastor, and this was difficult because long before I got to Hiawatha, long after I left Hiawatha, the guy that taught all 4 years of high school, Sunday school, was a fundamentalist. And I mean, he was grounded in the kid's head, by golly, this is how it is. I was also it's hard to believe I was ever a youth group sponsor. But when I was like in my late 20s, yeah, that I got time with the kids and explained, Mr. So-and-so who teaches Sunday school, this isn't necessarily how it is, because wouldn't you rather know that there are inconsistencies in the Bible from your preacher, from your Sunday school teacher, than from in Bible lit class in college when you're 20 and the professor may be an agnostic? Part of the reason we talk about this is apologetic, that we want people to know there are difficulties there, but there are answers. But much more than that, now I actually typed this up in bold letters for myself. What the historical critical method does more than anything else is let the writers of the individual books of the Bible speak for themselves. It's attempts to get them back to what they were saying to their original readers, what they had in mind. Does anyone like to be misquoted? Now, I have a special take on this. I was in the two most misquoted professions, ministry and medicine. And it's amazing when you're a pastor, you preach a sermon, and then it's like people say, well, what you said there, it's like, I didn't say that. But that's nothing compared to what patients think their doctor told them. I know what it's like to be misquoted. And what the historical critical method tries to do is, we don't read the Bible to find what we want. We read it, what did the original writers mean when they wrote this? And there are a couple of tools that we're going to examine today that talk about that. And again, what does this have to do with the disciples of Christ? And this lecture today, not very much. But when we get to next week's lecture, part one of the best of times, the worst of times, roughly about 1893, these were hot issues in every Protestant denomination, and especially in this denomination. One of the things that you need to become familiar with is the idea of synonymous writing. I'm probably not saying it right. Writing, it would be like this. I'd like to think I'm a good preacher. But you know, if I took a collection of my sermons and tried to get them published and said, yeah, Fred Craddock preached these, that's synonymous. I'm trying to publish my work in somebody else's name. And you know that saying, imitation is the highest form of flattery? Now, in this day and age, that would be considered inappropriate. But I was thinking, mores change, values change. I don't have many, I'm probably the oldest man in the room. But any of you here, in your growing up in school, this was certainly true in my day, were ever physically disciplined by a teacher? Okay, I see a number of hands go up. And you know, 50 years ago, if I'd come home from school and said, Dad, the coach swatted me, and you know what my dad's response would be? You probably deserved it. Because I mean, you had physical discipline at home and the parents backed the teachers then. If a teacher swatted a student today, what would happen? The teacher would be fired, would be arrested, go to jail. The principal might be fired. The school district would get sued. It would be on the news, and there would be a whole new round of in-school training for teachers about boundaries. And that's only in 50 years. Not even 50 years, yeah. How something can swing so dramatically. And again, today, you know, if we were trying to publish something and somebody else's, it's the opposite of plagiarism. It's like you want to give your added authority to what you say. And so you publish under somebody's famous name. You couldn't do that. That's not right. But just like getting paddled in gym class 50 years ago, in the biblical times, this was common. It was very common to publish something under somebody else's name. Now, the problem is, today, one of the things about the historical critical method is we can pick out, say, what Paul wrote, the real Paul, and what people wrote in Paul's name. Any of you like Taylor Swift? She's a great artist. Have you ever noticed all of her songs sound alike? Pretty much. Now, I was working on this yesterday, kind of in a silly mood. Do you remember the old Blue Oyster Cult song, Don't Fear the Reaper? Can you imagine if Taylor Swift tried to cover Don't Fear the Reaper? We would all know that she didn't write that because it's just so different. And those of you who are teachers, you can tell if a kid's copying, most of the time, because the writing is different. When I was a pastor, there's a girl in the church that, again, the different time, when they could still do prayers at graduation. And she wanted me to write the prayer. And so after the graduation, my secretary said, well, obviously she didn't write that prayer. Did you do it? A couple weeks ago, we looked at two passages supposedly from Paul. 1 Corinthians, where he tells widows, in light of the times, if your husband passes, don't get married again. And then in 1 Timothy, where Paul says, you know, if you're a widow, get married. How do you explain the difference? Now, obviously, there was a real man named Paul who was converted on the road to Damascus, who made 3 missionary journeys, who was killed in Rome, and who actually did write books that we have. There are books like Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, 1 Thessalonians, that nobody in the world doubts that the real Paul wrote them. But there are other books. The 3 biggies being 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, that if you read them, and let me go back. I had 10 hours of Greek in seminary. If you've taken a foreign language, you don't know squat about a language with 10 hours. And that was 40 years ago. I mean, yeah, I tried to keep up a couple years when I was in the ministry, but I lost it. I mean, people who spend their lives studying Greek in the New Testament, when they read Romans, hello, and they read 1st and 2nd Timothy, it's like, wait a second. This is, you know, it's like Taylor Swift singing Don't Fear the Reaper. That this is different. So one of the things of understanding the differences is to realize that the Corinthian passage really was written by Paul, no question. The Timothy passage, well, probably written by somebody else in Paul's name pseudonymously at a later point. Anybody here like Hallmark movies? None of the men's hands go up. And you know that there are only like 5 plots in Hallmark Christmas movies. Everybody agrees with that. One of the plots is a person gets the diagnosis from their doctor, an erroneous diagnosis, that they only have a few months to live. And then how that changes their life. And then later they find out, I'm okay. Now, all of us are going to die. But none of us are planning to die, you know, in the next 3 months. Now, I don't know about you, but if I ever got the diagnosis, Steve, you're gone in 3 months, the question would not be whether I'm going to do this. The only question would be what color the Corvette would be. But you know, if you think your time is short, you're going to live differently. And anybody disagree with that? Now, one of the things in the early church was they believed that Jesus was coming back soon. So when did the resurrection occur? Somewhere between 33 AD. When did Paul write 1 Corinthians? 53 AD, roughly 54. 20 years later. And they still had the idea that, you remember that great line in Casablanca where they're at the airfield, he goes, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday soon in the rest of your life you're going to regret this. You remember that Jesus was coming back, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday soon. And so, you know, if Jesus is coming back in 6 months, why are you going to get married? You need to work for the Lord. But what about another 30 years? Say it gets to be 70 or 80 AD. Paul's dead. The apostles are dead. Jesus hasn't come back yet. And suddenly, people began to think, well, maybe we ought to hunker in for the duration. That the sense of imminence is not so great there. And so Paul writes, ladies, if you're widowed, get married again. You see this? Okay. So one of the things is pseudonymity. The other is genre. Define what a genre is.
It's like a style of
A
writing?
style of writing or doing anything else. I'm going to write the names of 3 creative geniuses on the board. Would anyone doubt that Beethoven was a creative genius? How about, and if I don't look, I'll spell it wrong. Anyone doubt that William Shakespeare was a creative genius? How about Michelangelo? Is God as good a creative genius of any of these 3 men or better? Better. But now, let's look at these guys' works. How many symphonies did Beethoven write? Anyone know? 9 symphonies. He wrote 1 opera. He wrote 32 piano sonatas. Two masses. And 15 string quartets. I'll just leave it. We talked about genres. Beethoven could write symphonies, operas, sonatas, masses, string quartets. And actually his total output of work was about 700 and something. He could write in different genres. Is there any problem with, Beethoven writing in more than one genre? No. William Shakespeare, 39 plays. $154 sonnets. 3 narrative poems. Is there anything wrong with Shakespeare using more than one genre, one form? Michelangelo, he worked in marble, sculpture. Obviously painting, the Sistine Chapel, among other things. He was an architect. And he worked in chalk drawings. Again, he worked in different genres. Now, again, no one would deny these men were creative geniuses. But you just told me God is a more creative genius than them, and I would totally agree with that. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you this. Is God limited to one genre? This is because you're all shaking your heads no. That's because you're 21st century disciples of Christ. If you're disciples of Christ in 1893, I'm not sure anybody would have walked out yet, but in a few minutes they would have. Many fundamentalists take the position that God only worked in one genre, and that was literal documented history. Y'all knew who Kate Turabian was? Megan, of course you do. She was the dissertation secretary at the University of Chicago forever. And she came up with the book, the academic writer's Bible, Turabian, that documented exactly how things had to be. And people who write theses and dissertations still typically follow Turabian. Did Kate Turabian influence the Apostle Paul? No. Does God have to follow modern documentation standards? No. God can certainly reveal God's self in the Scripture in literal, actual history. And certainly if you read the Old Testament after about 1000 BC on, you're in very accurate history. But God is free to work in other genre. In other words, the Bible, I'd be in bad shape if I went to grab it and there wasn't one there. God is free in God's Word to work in more than detailed factual history. Anybody here like historical novels? Okay. Are there any in this book? There are. One of the, I'm not sure that I would call it a cute tale, is the book of Esther. Now, there's a King Xerxes, but if you look at the other details about all the people, and you look at history, these folks aren't real. This is a story, this is a historical novel that's set during the Persian period. And the reason is that to Jews in times of persecution, the idea was that God will always be with you. And it conveys that message well. But is it fact? No. It's a historical novel. And God, like Beethoven or Shakespeare or Michelangelo, has the freedom to convey God's message however God wants. This is when the people in 1893 would have walked out. Now, what if, so we're going to end early today, but that's okay. Does anybody like parody? I love parody songs. And they're all over the internet now. Can God work in parody? Yeah. Let me give you an example. We talked 2 weeks ago about the two different creation narratives in Genesis. In Genesis 1, you have the very majestic, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Genesis 2, it's like, the little kid down making mud pies. God carefully fashioned Adam, blew the breath of life into Adam, and then, okay, Adam, what do you think of these creatures? The time sequence doesn't work between the two stories, the order of creation. But it's not supposed to, because neither one of them are meant to be taken literally. Now, let me have a little Coca-Cola and wipe this board off, and I'll be. One of my take-homes from this week is, if you have a whiteboard, please wipe it off after you use it, because this stuff does get burned in. They unfortunately don't have screensavers for this. Of course, I realize that I'm the only person who still uses a whiteboard and not PowerPoint. What?
Hand sanitizer is the best thing to clean off the board once it's got the blue stuff still stuck on there.
Thank you. I will try that. I did not know that. But I guess the advantage of the whiteboard is that you can't do the fingernail thing on it. We have a chair at home on the patio that when I rock on it, it sounds exactly like fingernails. And my wife goes, "Stop that!" A little bit of Old Testament history. In the Hebrew Scriptures, what are the two formative times for the people of God? The Exodus, when, they came through the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, and were rescued from the hands of the Egyptians. And the second time is the exile. Can somebody tell me what the Babylonian exile was? Somebody goes, oh, they were exiled to Babylon. The kingdom, King David reigned from about 1000 to about 960 BC. Solomon was from 960 to about 920 BC. At that point, the kingdom split into the northern and southern kingdom. The northern kingdom did not follow the Davidic line. It ended in 722 BC to the Assyrians. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted until 587 BC and fell to the Babylonians. Now, what's that in here? 413 years. How long has the United States been around? Not nearly that long. A little more than half of it, a little more than. Can you imagine the history of a nation that had the same dynasty of rulers for 413 years and who believed that they were God's chosen people? And you know, what do we tell little kids? God is everywhere. And they probably told their kids that also. But in a way, for them, God wasn't everywhere. God was one specific place. Where was it?
The temple.
The temple. And about roughly 700, give or take a few years, BC, the Jerusalem was surrounded by the enemy, King Sennacherib. And it was kind of like their Kiev, that the capital was surrounded and they were trying to force the people of Jerusalem to capitulate. And King Hezekiah would not do that. And do you know what happened? The enemy suddenly went away. Now the Bible says, well, you know, the Spirit of the Lord slew 185,000 men one night. Well, maybe it didn't quite happen that way. Maybe it was more like there was a problem back home when they had to go back and fight a different war. But their backs were to the wall, and there was salvation provided. So what's that saying that investment advisors always use? Past behavior is the best predictor of future. You know what I'm saying? But it doesn't always work that way. They took the position that because God had rescued them in the darkest hour once, because they had God's temple there, would God let God's temple fall? And the answer they had was, no, no way. And so the idea was that Jerusalem was inviolable. You know, it's you know, that it was kind of like the other team gets the ball first and goal on the 1 yard line. And come fourth down, the defense holds. That it was always going to be like that. You know, that there was going to be a goal line stand because this is where God lived, and God wouldn't allow that to happen. Well, what happened in 587 BC?
The temple was destroyed.
It was destroyed. It was leveled. Now, what was the name of the God of Israel? Yahweh. So the leadership of Judah is carried away to Babylon. And, you know, if you get whooped by another country, and then you go and see their capital, and their capital is way nicer than anything you ever knew was, and you believe in a personal God, what would it say about your God vis-a-vis the Babylonians' God? Who is greater? Make you think. Anybody, I love this. What the name of the Babylonian god was? You remember what it was? Marduk. What was that cartoon? Was it Marmaduke the dog?
Yeah, Marmaduke.
Marduk was the head god of their pantheon of deities. It would be so tempting for them to say, yeah, we had our little temple back home and, we believed in Yahweh, but, they whooped us, they brought us here, and they have a far better culture than we. What would have been the easiest thing to do? Give up. It's like, okay, we put our faith in the wrong thing, let's worship Marduk. Is that what they did? One of the great heroes, in my opinion, in the Bible was Ezekiel. Ezekiel worked during this time. And what he basically did, he worked among the exiles, was reinterpret the story. Guys, we're not here because Marduk's better than Yahweh. We're here because we sinned. This is punishment. It will end. We will go back. We will have a new beginning. Did that happen? Yeah. But make no mistake, the captivity had a massive effect, the exile. And most of us, you remember, say 30 years ago, what the church board would have said if Tom Lorenz said, I want to have a praise band in worship. People can come in sweats and shorts, and we're going to have video messaging boards. What would the board have told him? No way. When I was in med school, I was a member of Countryside Christian Church and Mission. That's where I met Shauna. And the pastor there, Roger Guy, was really way, way ahead of his time. Because in the late 1980s, he was pushing contemporary worship, which is way ahead of the curve. But boy, it was like pulling teeth. And it was funny that there were people who were so staid in that church that even if it wasn't at their service, the idea that a guitar might be in their holy sanctuary was blasphemous. Do you remember all the people, how boring worship could be in the 70s and 80s for young people?
I think we were ahead of the curve in California.
Probably so, as in many things. Part of the reason young people left is because church services were boring. And the idea of, rock music, guitar music in churches, that was anathema. People want to hear the message in their own language, their own style. Now it's here that's interesting, the idea of parody. The Old Testament talks about the beginning of the world in very, I got probably time to read it, if my voice holds out. Just think about how poetic, how solemn this is. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless, void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day and the darkness night. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to drink a Coca-Cola. But you all know how this goes. And it actually takes all of about 31 verses to tell the story. And 2 weeks ago, we looked at the order of the story. The waters are separated, there's heaven and earth. Now, for a long time, people thought that Bible was maybe the oldest book there was. And how it was in Genesis was how it was. And then in the 1800s, people began to explore the ancient Near East, and they began to do archaeological digs. And lo and behold, they came to the area of Babylon, and they found something called the Enuma Elish. Which I thought was interesting. My spell checker thought that was Anima Elish. Enuma Elish. And unlike Genesis, the story in Genesis 1, which is 31 verses, their tale is about 1,000 verses. But just as there were the 7 days of Genesis, there were 7 tablets of the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian story of creation, tells in a very different way what happened in Genesis. But the order is the same. And it's interesting that that's not the only other ancient Near Eastern literature that the Bible follows. Now, you remember in the story in Genesis 3, the fall of humankind? Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But there's another special tree there in the garden, and it was the tree of life. And if you ate from that, you would live forever. And they are cast out so they don't eat from that tree. Now, again, who's the agitator in the story of the fall of humankind? The snake. If you look at the story of the Gilgamesh epic, one of the Mesopotamian creation stories, it also includes a flood narrative. There's the primeval couple, they're Adam and Eve, and they're in a garden. And what they want is the herb of life. And if they eat the herb of life, they will live forever. But what keeps them from eating the herb of life? A snake. One of the things that the historical critical method allows us to do is to look at different genre. In the early chapters of Genesis, the writers are looking at the stories of their captors and saying, let's try to relate this to what we believe. Not that there's a head god called Marduk who presides over this pantheon of fighting deities, but that there's one God, Elohim, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the stories of Babylon are recast in a way that speaks figuratively to the creation of the world. And I'll see you next week.